Good evening. It's 5:15 and I'm happy to start this webinar in Singapore. My name is Kanti Bajpai and I'm Director of the Center on Asia and Globalization, which is part of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore. We're very happy to present this webinar to you and to have Dr. Luke Patey speak to us from Denmark. The topic of the session today is China undermining its own global ambitions? Quite a provocative title, and I hope an interesting one. I'm sure it will be. It's drawn in a good crowd of participants, and so we're very excited about it. Luke is senior researcher at the Danish Institute for International Studies and lead senior research fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, University of Oxford. A little bit more on him. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, Financial Times, The Guardian, The Hindu, an Indian newspaper, Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy. He's written, of course, books and articles of a more academic nature, but his books include The New Kings of Crude, China, India, and the Global Struggle for Oil in Sudan and South Sudan, which is a book which I read and admire. You've seen the write-up on the talk, but just to refresh the kind of context that we're bringing to this session, I think we're all aware of the strategic competition increasingly between the United States and China and the growing intensity of it. But the question, of course, that now increasingly confronts us is how is the rest of the world responding to China's rise? Are issues such as the Belt and Road Initiative launched by China, are these tending to move countries towards a kind of debt trap, or is it simply just business? And are there win-win situations all around there? How are other regions responding, including ones that we in Asia perhaps don't pay as much attention to? Europe, of course, Africa, Latin America. Luke has done a terrific job in the book, which I'll mention in a minute, of really accessing opinions and trends and policies and responses in these regions, which I think we in Asia don't pay as much attention to. And I think one of the issues that he raises is whether the United States, which is behind the efforts to orchestrate responses in these different regions to China, or are there more kind of local, well thought out responses, or sometimes ill thought out responses, but which are local in effect. The book, I mentioned it, which this talk draws on, is titled How China Loses, the Pushback Against Chinese Global Ambitions. It was published by Oxford University Press, USA, earlier this year. Speaking to Luke a little earlier, he told me that, in a sense, the book began in a place very distant from Singapore, which is in Argentina when he was there, going back about 5 years. So the book has been quite a time in the making. 5 years is a good bit of time, and things change. I have read the book. I've been privileged to read it, and it does a fabulous job of covering different regions and powers that are responding to China. And one of the points I note in the book is how current it began 5 years ago, but the story really is very up to date, up to and including some of the consequences of the COVID pandemic on how countries are responding. As I said, the book has taken him to all parts of the world, and I think I'm saying again to him that very few books have in a sense, covered all those regions. We in Asia are seeing more and more materials on how Asia responds, but I think one of the fascinating things about this book is that it's written very accessibly for a wide-ranging audience of people from all kinds of professional and other backgrounds, and really appeals to the kind of informed thinking person, but a person who may not be a specialist in international security or even China, global and foreign policy issues. Is very readable and and accessible to the lay reader, the interested lay reader. At any rate, I won't give the whole game away. I think I've had my 4 or 5 minutes to just give you a little background on it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Luke. I know he's got some slides that he will share, so you will see those on screen. He will speak from them. A little bit on the nature of the program itself. Luke has agreed to speak for about 35 minutes. We'll have about 30 minutes of Q&A thereafter, and then I will wrap up at the end. In terms of your questions, we very much look forward to them. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom to type in your questions, and then I will access those questions. My research assistants will try and help me. I will either ask them directly as they come in or try and summarize some of them, depending on the number of questions, and Luke is happy with that procedure. So without further ado, let me welcome Luke Patey to our midst and turn it over to him. Luke, all yours.
Thanks so much, Professor Bashbai. It's excellent. Thanks so much for the kind introduction. It's great to be with you this evening, morning time in Copenhagen. I hope my slides are up in full, and I'm really grateful for the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy for hosting this talk, and I look forward to present some of the findings of my book over the next 30 minutes or so, and I look forward to the Q&A to follow. What I want to do today is basically highlight some of the points in my book by presenting 4 different numbers that I think reflect some of the misperceptions that are out there on China and its role in global affairs, and some of the challenges that China faces as it expands as it tries to expand its global influence. Now, the book argues that the current direction of China's foreign policy limits and can even undermine its ultimate global ambitions. This does not mean that China is not a significant power. It is already an economic superpower. It's the world's largest trader. It's on its way to become the world's largest economy. It also commands a powerful military, and for a middle-income country, it has impressive technological capabilities. But I think because we often think of China's rise within the framing of its rivalry with the United States, we downplay the significance of its relations with the rest of the world. In recent years, there's been a flood of media stories and books and analysis on the US-China strategic competition, but this can reduce our understanding of China and limit our understanding of its influence in other regions. So what I wanted to do in the book was to basically highlight some of these broader relations and to really see if we're heading to a future where China will be in charge of global affairs and the global economy. And what I found was that China's interests around the world are facing new risks and challenges in developing countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, and pushback from advanced economies in Europe and Asia. And rather than a future with China dominating, we live in a world that will continue to be shaped by a diversity of power. So moving forward, rather than a US-China rivalry alone as paramount to world affairs, we need to take a look at how China's relations with the rest of the world are shaping the extent of its influence. So let's start with the first number to help explain China's global power and influence. And that number is $3.5 billion. This figure represents the fall in Canadian exports from 2018 to 2019 to China. Now, why is this significant to define China's influence? Well, what happened in late 2018 in Vancouver airport was that Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou was arrested by Canadian authorities. And in response, Chinese authorities detained 2 Canadians in China, and later on placed a number of trade restrictions and tariffs on Canadian canola, this yellow plant you see in one of the slides there. They placed restrictions on Canadian pork and other agricultural goods. And many observers saw these trade restrictions and the detentions of the Canadians as a response to Canada's arrest of Meng. So the question is, China's economic coercion, is it working? Canada is not the only case that's faced this type of coercion from China. Australia has more recently, but also South Korea, Norway, and others in the past. So is it having the desired effect for China's foreign and security policy? Are targeted countries responding as Beijing wishes? The answer is largely no, and there are 3 reasons why. First, I feel that the Western and Chinese media both tend to exaggerate the level of trade that is ultimately targeted by Beijing. So Canada's exports fell by 3.5 billion over 2018 to 2019. But Canada's exports in total in 2019 were 450 billion. So it's quite a small sliver of the fall. The fall in the exports was quite a small sliver of Canada's total trade. We see the same thing in the Norwegian case. This was around 10 years ago when the Nobel Committee in Oslo awarded the Peace Prize to Liu Xiaobo, a jailed Chinese intellectual who later passed away in prison. Beijing placed a 6-year diplomatic freeze on Norway, cut off salmon exports from the Scandinavian country. But in the period of 2011 to 2013, Norway lost around 1.3 billion in exports to China. This, of course, is a sizable sum on its own. The Norwegian fishing industry could not freely export salmon to Chinese markets, but overall, this represented only a drop of 0.3% of Norway's total annual exports. And even during this freeze in 2015, Norway's trade with China paradoxically reached new heights. And this is the case because, the second point, China doesn't place comprehensive sanctions on countries that it's targeting. This is unlike the US, which has done so with Sudan, North Korea, Iran, placed much more comprehensive sanctions on economic cooperation with those countries. China instead targets goods selectively, trying not to minimize the damage it does, these trade measures will do to its own domestic industries, and even uses trade measures to help boost its domestic industries at home. So take Australia, for example. There's been a growing number of political disputes between Canberra and Beijing in recent years, from Australia's decision to not allow Huawei and ZTE to operate in their 5th generation mobile networks, to Australia's call for an independent inquiry into the origin of the COVID pandemic. And Beijing's response last year was to place bans and high tariffs on a long line of Australian exports, including barley, coal, and lobster. But Australia's iron ore exports to China were never targeted. This was because China needed this resource for its own economic stimulus. Similar in the Canada case, pork was originally targeted by China, but because of the African swine flu decimating China's pig population in 2018-19, some 40–50% of that population was wiped out, and China reversed this decision on pork and bought Canadian pork again to make up that gap. It also quietly started buying up Canadian canola again because of food security concerns that were spiked during the COVID-19 pandemic. Neither did it ever touch semiconductor chips from South Korea when it targeted South Korea's trade in 2017. So the point here is that China has interests too. It does not want to upset its growth all too much through these trade measures. The final point in showing the limits of China's economic coercion is that China can find alternative buyers for the commodities it targets. And media reports, both in the West and China, often point out how American exporters are benefiting from Australia's loss through its trade dispute with China. But because commodities are fungible, there are also alternative buyers for those countries that are targeted. So there was this fear early on with Australia that some 25 billion in exports would be lost because of China's restrictions. But many of these targeted goods have found new buyers in India, Japan, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. So you see just quickly by these two graphs, you can see that the blue line represents the exports of coal and other products to other countries than China, whereas the red one represents those exports to China. And you can see that the damage was quite minimal. There are, of course, some industries like lobster that were affected, but the number has not come near to that 25 billion estimate. The next number, moving along, is 66%. This number signifies the findings of a study done by the Said School at the University of Oxford that showed that 2/3 of the transport and energy projects built in China did not generate economic productive activity to justify their cost. And this is important because it raises in questions about China's Belt and Road Initiative and the limitations of that initiative in spurring on development in the countries that it engages. We often hear about the Belt and Road Initiative, at least here in Europe and the US and in India, whether it's a debt trap or whether it's just a benign, just business approach of expanding commercial interest from China. And people I spoke to in Africa and other parts of the world about the Belt and Road, they have another question, and that is, will it spur on developmental success? Will it help these countries develop? Now, the Belt and Road is obviously Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy, and he has, really promised much from it. For example, in 2018, at the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, Xi called African countries to step on the express train to China's development. And China hopes that the Belt and Road will help expand its political legitimacy in the world. But China also has economic aims from this initiative, such as offshoring capacity in heavy industries and expanding the outreach of its own companies. And these political goals and economic goals can conflict with one another. And I'll give you 3 reasons why that's the case and why there are some limitations to the developmental impact the Belt and Road can have for partner countries. First, of course, developing countries, particularly those in Africa, desperately need new infrastructure. And China is helping to fill a massive gap of some $100 billion a year that Africa, for example, has. But not any infrastructure at any cost will do. Infrastructure needs to generate new economic productive activity, and particularly for countries with low borrowing capacities, they have very little room to make mistakes. There's very little sort of risk threshold that they have compared to an economy like China with its great manufacturing capacity. It can afford the infrastructure that it's put out in recent decades. So, infrastructure does not necessarily lead to strong economic growth and development success just by its construction. And it can also incentivize misspending, encourage local corruption, as we've seen with the Belt and Road in Sri Lanka, Malaysia, and Kenya. And this is not a China-specific quality. This is just infrastructure in general, that it brings on these qualities when it's constructed. Secondly, however, these projects are Chinese-dominated projects, meaning that Chinese contractors are largely building them. And this has the effect of crowding out local industry from the beginning. China's economic conditions in its finance it provides in the Belt and Road can undermine domestic industries and companies to participate in the new growth. And I think this is particularly the case, in Southeast Asia, and we saw former Prime Minister Mohammed Mahathir push back against China to ensure that local industries would have a larger stake in the construction of projects in Malaysia. This is also the case in South Asia. Even several large African countries also have considerable construction companies that could be taking part more in these initiatives if China wants to build that political legitimacy through the Belt and Road. Finally, a number of scholars have over the years pointed out that there will come a manufacturing miracle out of China into the developing world, particularly into Africa, that will create jobs and help develop African economies at a large scale. Research shows otherwise. In recent years, many Chinese manufacturers are actually staying at home and automating, even though they have higher labor costs. Those that do go abroad tend to focus on Southeast Asia, closer to home, better infrastructure, and similar lower costs as Africa. And Africa, even in Africa, we often hear the story of Ethiopia and some success there. But Africa, of course, is not one country alone. And the disbursement of the manufacturing investments from China are quite weak elsewhere. Now, the challenges that the Belt and Road faces does not mean that China is not gaining influence in the developing world. I think across Africa and Latin America and many parts of developing Asia, China has gained much through its engagement. And the struggles that it's facing, the Belt and Road's facing currently are seen by falling levels of finance being offered by China in recent years. But this doesn't mean that other major powers should sit back and watch. China is in the process of reinventing the Belt and Road into a digital, into a green, into a COVID-19 health enterprise. And the US and India and others can improve their engagement in the developing world. But I think we often lose track of the fact that the developing world wants and is engaging a diversity of foreign actors, including China, including the US, including the EU, which is still the largest trading partner to the African continent, including Japan, which is still the largest provider of finance to Southeast Asia, and including, I think more in the future, India, which before the recent spread, second wave of COVID in India was donating more vaccinations to the world and the developing world than China was. So we do see this diversity of engagement in the developing world, and this is what I think most developing countries want. They don't want to be in anyone's orbit, Chinese, American, or otherwise. So the third number we have is 2025, and 2025, some of you might recognize, is the targeted year of China's industrial policy, Made in China 2025, that strives to expand China's share in advanced manufacturing and high-tech industries to really dominate these new industries such as robotics, electrical vehicles, artificial intelligence in the future through state subsidies, through advancing state-owned enterprises and pursuing foreign acquisitions to climb up the technological ladder. This is a major issue when it comes to Europe-China relations, and that's something I look at in depth in the book. And relations between the EU, the European Union, and China over the past couple of decades have grown dramatically. They have really taken off in trade. Investment has also improved in both sides. But it's also a relationship that recently has been upset by political differences. And I think more concerning for many European leaders is the economic competition between the two sides and how China's rise affects European competitiveness and welfare. So over the past 5 years, I would say the EU has began to recognize China as an economic competitor. And this happened for 3 reasons in particular. First, from 2000 to 2017, foreign investment from China into the EU outpaced that of the EU going into China. In 2016 marked the high point where $35 billion of Chinese investment went into the European Union. This was still a minor amount compared to what the US invests in Europe, for example. But it still caught people's notice because Chinese investments are mostly acquisitions. They're not greenfield investments tied to building factories or new service centers that create jobs and growth. They are the takeover of companies. And only 5% of Chinese investment between 2010 and 2019 is actually classified as greenfield investment in Europe. The second reason was made in China 2025, that these acquisitions were coming in at the same time that China had launched this new policy that said deliberately, we want to be the leaders in advanced manufacturing, and we're going to do it through state support. The final thing to catch European decision makers' attention was that China didn't really change the lack of market reciprocity between the two economies. So Chinese investment restrictions for European companies and for other foreign companies are still 4 times higher than the OECD average, still the 4th highest among the G20. And as Chinese companies and Chinese industries were becoming increasingly competitive, this really caught European decision makers' attention. And in 2019, the EU officially designated China as a strategic competitor. And this went beyond simple words in a policy paper. The EU launched an investment screening mechanism that year. A number of members have raised new barriers on foreign investment, and Germany, Italy, and others have blocked several Chinese investments in recent years in advanced manufacturing, in semiconductors. And this really has cut off one avenue that China can pursue in building its technological capabilities through foreign acquisitions. Because if you think now, China is facing really a difficult task of acquiring manufacturing and tech companies overseas. If you think of the US with CIFUS and its restrictions, Japan, and now the EU as well. So, of course, late last year, the EU signed a provisional investment deal with China. But today we're getting news that the European Parliament, rather than beginning the process of ratifying it, is putting the deal on ice until political sanctions between the two sides are dropped. Even if those are dropped, however, and the deal goes through, it still doesn't broadly level the playing field for European businesses in China. It improves conditions, but it's selective market access that's being offered, and the enforcement mechanisms, experts have argued, are still quite weak. So the challenges facing the EU-China relationship are likely to continue, even if this investment deal somehow manages to wrestle free of the political restraints it's currently in. Now, this is not to say that trade and investment isn't flowing between the EU and China. It is. Top European companies are still pursuing opportunities in the Chinese market, but there is a growing disillusionment with China in Europe. Europe has become defensive in nature. It's expanding its defensive toolkit, including possible anti-subsidy rules against Chinese and other foreign companies that receive state support within the EU. And Germany is on track to elect a new government this autumn. And this may lead to the Green Party having a larger role in decision-making, and that may lead to a tougher approach to China compared to Angela Merkel's conciliatory one at the moment. The last number this evening I want to present is a simple one, but an important one. It's 4. And 4 is the number of members in the quadrilateral security dialogue. They are, as many of you know, US, Japan, India, and Australia, the so-called Quad, this strategic informal dialogue that is gaining some traction between its partners into actual policies and outcomes. Now, the Chinese government often presents the Quad as a US-directed cooperation to contain its rise. I think this undervalues the role of the other members in the growth of the Quad in recent years, in its future strength and its possible future weakness. The other members to date have grown more cautious about China's economic and military rise in Asia. Already in 2007, long time before Donald Trump was in the White House, and tensions and trade wars grew between the US and China, Japan's then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe traveled to New Delhi and spoke to the Indian Parliament, seeking to foster new economic, political, and defense ties, and doing so not only to hopefully drive forward closer ties between the second and third largest economies in Asia, but also doing so to try to balance against what Abe saw as China's future rise moving forward. So Japan, I think, played a critical role in building the Quad later on, as it was already thinking towards the future back in 2007. Japan, has done much to balance against China in recent years. After experiencing a brief blockade of rare earth exports in 2012 from China, Japan started to develop an alternative supply chain that President Biden is today discussing with the Quad partners. Now, this alternative supply chain went to support an Australian company to mine rare earths, went to support a Malaysian facility to refine those rare earths, and it only punched a small hole in China's dominance of that industry, but one that saw Japan's rare earth dependency on China drop from 87% in 2006 to roughly 60% in 2018. On the economic front, President Trump abandoned the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Japan picked it up, kept the agreement alive, and rallied the remaining 11 members to sign the trade pact in 2018. And on defense, Japan has fostered closer ties with India. 2+2 defense and foreign ministerial dialogues in 2019 were passed. There's now an agreement between Tokyo and New Delhi to have access and share one another's overseas military bases. The same types of relationships have been developing between Japan and Australia. And India has also, played a more active role within the Quad in the recent year or two. This, I think, came out of the recent fighting between China and India on their shared Himalayan border. And this really shattered, I think, the hopes that were there after the Wuhan summit in 2018 and the Chennai Connect summit between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi in 2019. And New Delhi sort of took a turn towards having a more outgoing role within the Quad. It accepted Australia's return to the Malabar military exercises, along with Japan and the US. And last year, these four militaries participated in training operations in the Bay of Bengal for the first time. More importantly, perhaps, India has banned dozens of Chinese apps. And unlike the US, it seems to be sticking to many of these bans on security grounds. It has also very recently joined a list of Asian Pacific countries, including Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, and Vietnam, that to some degree or fully have been restricting the role of Chinese telecom giant Huawei in their 5G networks. So one, has to ask the question, if China can't participate fully within India's 1.3 billion population when it comes to expanding its tech standards, how can it really become a global tech leader? Even outside of the Quad, Southeast Asia is I think has long recognized the diversity of foreign powers that are at work in its region, and I think many of the people in the audience will know this already. But China is the largest trading partner. It's physically connected to the region. It plays a big role. But at the same time, the U.S. and the EU the U.S. remains the largest investor. The EU is also a big investor. And Japan is the largest provider of finance to the region. And this demonstrates this diversity of power that's out there, the possibility for ASEAN states to balance between outside powers. Even the majority of expert respondents in a 2020 poll of Southeast Asian countries said they would like their countries to take part in the Quad, to take part in that security framework. And here sorry, did I lose you?
Yeah, I think we briefly lost you. So maybe just, I think go ahead. We probably didn't lose a big chunk, but you were on Southeast Asia. Yeah.
Yes. So I just wanted to make the last final point that the negative perceptions on China also stretch across much of the Asia Pacific region, that China is facing a more cautious neighborhood to its expanding economic and military power. So I will conclude and to say that I hope that I've made my main point, that China is, of course, a significant global power, but it is facing new challenges, and the US-China rivalry alone will not dictate, I think, the extent of its ultimate influence. It will need to repair and manage its relationships with other major powers and the developing world moving forward. And I think other major powers can play a bigger role in trying to rein in the sort of big power politics of China and the US, that they have demonstrated the ability to push ahead trade deals such as Japan has done, and that they can, if they can find ways to cooperate more, also deter some of China's assertiveness in the military realm and promote, compromise and cooperation based on international rules moving forward. So I'll stop there and thank you for your attention.
Well, Luke, thank you very much, and thanks brilliantly for keeping to time as well. You're right on the money. I think as questions come in, maybe I'll just get us started with one from my side. And it pertains to your bigger point about the role increasingly of middle powers. So it's not just a world of the United States and China and their rivalry, but there's a significant number of middle powers beginning to play a role. And you portray that as middle powers to some extent pushing back against China and beginning to formulate their own policies, sometimes amongst themselves, sometimes directly towards China and other theaters, India playing a role, Japan playing a role in Africa, and so on. But my question, I guess, is, again, it takes us a little bit back to US-China, but do you see a positive role for these middle powers in trying to bridge the differences between the United States and China? That's an old question going back to US-Soviet Cold War days. And I think middle powers did, to some extent, put themselves forward as possible bridge powers. And I'm wondering to what extent your research indicated that there's a willingness or an interest in these middle powers in trying to also play a bridging role. And then if you'd answer that, and then I see questions coming, so we'll go with those.
No, it's an excellent question. I don't think it's one I give enough justice to in this book. And I think it's something that is still sort of being felt out by some of these middle powers. I think the EU, for example, has a different position towards China than the United States. They don't see China in such a threatening security dimension, for example. And they would like the US to sort of roll back some of the cuts in technology and economic cooperation that Trump and the Biden administration is presenting. But, from sitting here in Copenhagen and being in Europe, what I'm recognizing is that China is making it very difficult for the EU to play that role, because a week doesn't go by, at least here in Denmark, where there's growing concerns of Chinese engagement in technologies such as Huawei, or in research and education cooperation, the loss of European know-how to Chinese competition, the growing competitiveness of Chinese companies to large European corporations, and the political tensions, despite Trump's sort of very visceral approach to China. Political tensions in Europe are still rising towards China, and this, I think Europe and India could play that role, a bridging role, but I think we'll need to see Beijing ease some of the pressures that it's placing on the EU and on India. I think we'll need to see the relationships between the EU and India and China improve before that bridging can take place. Because right now, I think China is doing a very good job of sort of pushing those middle powers towards the US approach.
That leads me to a question that we have received here, which is, you as an observer have picked up pushback or caution or kind of unease in various countries. And one of the questions is, very broadly speaking, the questioner asked a more focused question, but I'll draw it up a bit bigger. To what extent do you find evidence that China has begun to notice the pushback, make adjustments? We've had the BRI now for several years. Beijing cannot be unaware of some of the doubts, worries about the BRI. To what extent do you think China has beginning to, factor that in?
No, I think, unfortunately, I'm a pessimist on this question. I think it's not reacting all too strongly to the resistance it has faced. Let me give you some. In Europe, we continue to see Chinese ambassadors speak quite aggressively at times, derogatorily towards Europe, and we've seen these sanctions that on Xinjiang that Europe began by sanctioning local level officials in Xinjiang, along with the Americans and Canadians in the UK, and China's response was to escalate tensions. and include European researchers and research institutes along with European parliamentarians, which I think most in the European policy community see as an escalation. So this wasn't demonstrating a China that was eager to compromise after seeing some years where Europe had become more cautious towards its relationship with China. So there is, I think, some concern in China, at least I've heard from Chinese experts, that the president is maybe not getting the full information of the tensions that China is building with some of these middle powers. I think, however, that also China has been very successful at home in its economic development, and it has seen the global financial crisis from the U.S. and political instability in the U.S. And problems with handling the COVID-19 pandemic here in Europe and of course in America, and it sees its position as a strong one, and that might be encouraging it also to not back down from some of its positions, that this is the moment where it can drive forward its own agenda.
Yeah, so a combination of a sort of bubble around the leadership maybe, and also great confidence in its relative rise and strengths at a time of global turbulence and perhaps challenges for other powers. So there are opportunities for it to stick by its. There's a question here which in a sense is related. There obviously, you pointed out and others, the risks of BRI on a lack of viability of projects, on debt sort of related issues. And yet countries are continuing to accept Chinese finance and Chinese companies coming in and materially building these projects. Do you see any evidence of countries really beginning to back away much more from BRI? Are there any countries that have really kind of backed off from their initial enthusiasm? And who are they, and what might be the dynamics there?
Well, I think who is mainly backing away of late, not abandoning, but sort of offering less finance is China itself. We've seen a strong drop in the finance offered to Africa and Latin America, where the World Bank still outpaces Chinese development banks in those regions. But yes, these are infrastructure hungry regions, and if there is no alternative to a Chinese offer, then countries aren't going to say no. That being said, we have seen, I think, a downsizing in Southeast Asia, Asian countries, of Chinese finance offers. So there was a recent study that that demonstrated that Japan is still the largest financer, even moving forward in Southeast Asia. Korea is also there, and what the Chinese are number two, of course, but they've had some $50 billion in financial projects that have been suspended or canceled. Now, Malaysia is an interesting case because Malaysia's engaging China quite comprehensively, including telecommunications and Huawei. But I think the Mahathir example I gave is how I think Southeast Asian countries are approaching the Belt and Road. That is to cancel projects that might push them to having too much finance, too many loans with China. So Mahathir, downsized the large railway project. He canceled some oil pipelines, but more importantly, he adjusted, he tinkered with the participation of Malaysian industry within these projects. And I think that's what we will see Southeast Asian countries, where a bulk of this finance goes from China, try to do moving forward, including countries like Indonesia. And it's not sort of a black and white abandon the Belt and Road. It's about China adjusting what it can offer, and these countries trying to have more participation within these projects. And it's important in all this talk of the Belt and Road to recognize that China is not alone in providing finance. As I said, Japan is there, in infrastructure. The World Bank is in Africa, providing mostly to social, education, health projects, but these are also necessary. China's not as much in that area. So it's important to recognize that diversity, to not see the developing world as a monolith, and that China has competition in infrastructure and among other foreign powers.
There's a question here on Pakistan, which of course is perhaps China's one of China's biggest recipients on the BRI and one of its closest, let's say, allies. And how do you see that one? Because if things don't quite pan out in the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, if there's some pushback there, surely that would raise questions then, both in China itself, of course, but also around the world on how well BRI goes forward.
Yeah, Pakistan is an amazing case because of just the extent of finance offered by China to the CPEC, this massive corridor that China and Pakistan want to develop from Gwadar port all the way through the expansion of the country to the Chinese border, including highways and coal plants and railways, and even prospects of an oil pipeline. Of course, Pakistan is another case where some projects have been downsized, some have been cut, but it's still a massive undertaking. And this, I think, to a certain extent, this project will really define the Belt and Road in the future. If it can help to re-energize the Pakistani economy, then it will really offer a promising story for the Chinese government to point to in the Belt and Road success. Pakistan, of course, points to another issue with the Belt and Road, which is its impact on global climate. A lot of the coal plants that China is building, are subcritical, low quality coal plants, so they produce even more emissions. And of course, countries like Pakistan, this is a secondary concern. Development is more important, but this will also, the polluting nature of many of the Belt and Road projects will nonetheless define its global image.
Let's shift focus a little bit. I'm getting a series of questions, somewhat more on the geopolitics, which you touched upon when you dealt with the fourth figure, the Quad, whereas most of your other analysis was on the either on infrastructure or technology and economics. But a number of questions have come in on the general kind of greater assertiveness, let's say, of China in Asia, particularly geopolitically, and the kind of, you pointed to the Quad as one form of pushback, but obviously there are concerns and unease in other ways in other countries as well. So I guess a two-part question. One, going back to this issue of how sensitive is China to, apparently a series of pushbacks or areas of concern from a range of about its greater assertiveness, and how do you see, the kind of the sort of unfolding of all these pushbacks? Will they tend to start building more and more coalitions? We have the Quad. We've got the French and the British sending now naval units into the South China Sea for patrols and so on for the first time after many, many years. They're beginning to exert an influence in this area. There are, of course, countries in Southeast Asia. You point out in the book that Japan is increasing its defense preparedness and spending and so on and so forth. So how do you see the broad kind of, as I say, appreciation of all this by China and its effects on its policies? Is China still tone deaf, or it just doesn't care about this? And to what extent is there going to be a coherence across all these actors who might want to start pushing back?
Excellent question. I think a lot will depend on the Asian middle powers, Japan, but more so how India shapes its relationship with China in the coming 5 or 10 years. If China and India are able to compromise more on their shared border, to make amends there, or at least to bring it back to a former status quo, then I think this will really undermine those countries that want to build tighter links, defense links. So India, I see as a sort of a linchpin in a lot of these partnerships. I think countries in Southeast Asia, like Indonesia, will want to have these other middle powers as part of these agreements. So China, is in the position where if it I think moves away, as I point in the book, if it moves away from this sort of picking fights with almost every middle power in its region and around the world, if it moves away from that, if it really tries to have a more compromising approach just to some of these middle powers, it can establish its influence, I think, more firmly within Asia. I mean, China's military, its navy, in particular, is growing at a pace that's unprecedented since World War II, and this is a significant buildup. And if it does pursue establishing even a stronger hold in the South China Sea and beyond into the Indian Ocean, it will only be able to be deterred by these cooperations in the Quad. It will only able to be deterred if countries in Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia, have a more active role within the Quad. And another sort of, I think, defining story to the region will be what happens with Taiwan. I'm not particularly concerned that China is eager for a military invasion, despite sort of media stories and politicians in the U.S. Sounding the alarm on that issue. I think Xi Jinping is still cautious politically in the coming couple of years, but the invasion itself can lead to events that work against China. If it fails, or if it's a hard victory, this could really hurt the Chinese economy and even the regional stability, of course. So, I think we are seeing an escalation, a tightening of these regional security pacts, and we are seeing Europe, at least France, and to a lesser degree the UK, getting more involved where they weren't doing so in the past. And that's a sign that the Quad is tightening. It's not fading away. It's growing.
There's a series of questions which I'm just going to pull together on, in a sense, China's ability to bring to bear another wing of its diplomacy. And I'd like you to kind of talk a little bit about how that might be regarded by both middle powers and smaller powers in various regions. And that's the Chinese provision of global public goods on climate change, its increasing role in multilateral institutions and regional institutions. More recently was its COVID outreach in terms of trying to provide the vaccine to various countries. I mean, there's a question here about how efficacious the vaccine is and so on and so forth, but it does seem that China's making a fairly big push on the vaccines as well. China has, amongst the permanent five, it's been the most prone to provide troops for UN peacekeeping, particularly in Africa, and you point out some interesting stories there in the book. How do you see that? Is China playing that card in response to some of the pushback, maybe, or has it been timid on that? And how is it being received? Is China's sort of good citizenship breaking through there, or not?
It depends on the region. I think it's breaking through in broadly speaking, in the developing world. There was a recent poll by Afrobarometer of 18 African countries that placed China as the #1 positive external influencer, just ahead of the US, but still outpacing the US. That said, the same poll showed that these African countries, respondents in them, still valued the US developmental model, democracy in particular, as their #1 choice over China's and others. So there is, I think, a sense that the world is certainly eager to cooperate with China, much of the world in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And if the United States, if India, if the EU doesn't offer alternatives, the US has been very slow in providing vaccinations for COVID. India was there, but then had to pull back. Then China will take up that space. It's that simple, I think. But at the same time, I don't see, China is not very involved in the COVAX program, unlike the Americans and the EU, which are backing it financially. China's peacekeeping is #1 among the P5 in providing troops and engineers to missions in South Sudan and Darfur and Congo. But many of those troops, over half of them, are within the Sudan, South Sudan. It's sort of where China had large oil investments in the past. It has stagnated. There hasn't been growth. It hasn't used this 8,000-man peacekeeping standby force that it said it would build up, and has built up, but still hasn't deployed it. And the EU has done that in the past, saying they would have a standby force, but then, of course, never elected to deploy it when the opportunity came. So there is a very strong promotional side, and of course, real consequences to China's global public goods provision, but they have their limits. I mean, China is mostly exporting PPE, exporting vaccinations, not donating it. So I think if the US starts providing those vaccinations, if Biden continues to push the multilateral agenda, and the Democrats in particular get a second term, we will see more China facing much more headwind in its engagement in global governance. And India is also, I think, a critical case. Once it gets out of its current troubles with COVID and ramps up production for the world again, that I think will have enormous potential for it also entering this sort of global public goods sphere of influence.
Yeah, there's a kind of a set of questions, reactions related to, kind of the differential reactions of different regions to China. I mean, broadly, one might say Latin America and Africa, to the extent that there's unease or pushback, it's over project implementation issues, perhaps hollowing out of local employment or not providing enough of a developmental kick, as you said, or indebtedness issues. In Southeast Asia, there may be some of that, but it turns a little bit more strategic, perhaps some of the worry, which is that there may be a growing Chinese influence through the projects, which I suppose Africans and Latin Americans are less worried about because they're not quite in that geostrategic zone. In India, it relates much more to, say, bilateral issues with China, in Japan as well. And there's sort of a clash of great power or putative great power rivalries. In Europe, it seems to relate to technology and competitiveness, likewise, perhaps the United States. This is a question of, whether all this will amount to a kind of fairly unified set of responses that makes China uneasy or causes it to change its policies, or whether because the responses are so diversified, China can kind of shrug it off and no unified coalition can sort of come together, is I guess the point that I'm pointing to.
Yeah, well, I think China has made considerable headway in large swaths of the developing world. And I think, its future relationship there will very much dictate its ultimate global influence. And it's important to point out in Africa that, and in Latin America, that Chinese projects, infrastructure projects in particular, are producing more local jobs than bringing in, Chinese manpower. But what for me is the critical point moving forward is who owns these manufacturing investments? Who are the companies that are profiting from cheap, low-cost labor in Africa? These are mainly Chinese. And if we don't see an increase in domestic investment, an increase in the domestic share of exports of manufactured goods, then the relationship becomes quite asymmetrical, even moving forward. And this provides an opportunity for others, the EU in particular, the US, India, to engage in a different way and to sort of win hearts and minds through building that capacity. And India, in much smaller ways, of course, is doing that in its engagement with Africa. So I don't think it's a done deal that we are heading towards a bifactorial world where China is closely aligned with the developing side, and Europe and Japan and the US are on the other. I think there is still time and potential for others to get more engaged in the developing world. And this is a key lesson that I point out in the book, that this is something others can learn from China, that China saw economic opportunity in these countries. It didn't see just crisis and poverty, or if you're in Europe, the migration threat that is often put up here. There is economic opportunity. These are emerging economies. And, if others want to play a bigger role in defining development norms, defining global norms moving forward, they will have to engage in these places at a much deeper level.
Yeah, that raises another question, which is a little implicit in some of the questions, which is, to what extent is it possible to think of, or is there evidence of actual partnerships between China, other powers, and local players? I mean, they're even regionally quite important players. I mean, you mentioned India several times. It does provide infrastructure and so on to its some of its neighbors. But again, in Africa, Latin America, I mean, one thinks of the Brazilians or the Argentinians with great capacities there. In Africa, South Africa, Nigeria, perhaps some others. So to what extent do you see a partnership between regional powers, these middle powers, the United States, Japan, EU, and China as well, and India? Is that a possibility, or is this just impossible, really?
At the moment, it's quite, I think, a steep climb. I had experienced in researching this book, I researched it during this time that Trump was cementing his very sort of divisive agenda, not only with China, but other parts of the world. And relations were deteriorating with the US and China. So at the beginning of the book, when I was working on South Sudan, I joined, a British civil society group, an African civil society representative, South Sudanese, in Beijing at the headquarters of a major Chinese oil company to discuss how the parties could work closer together to ensure there weren't sort of environmental degradation from oil production. So we had these sort of micro partnerships between African countries, Western countries, and China. We saw this also with the Ebola crisis outbreak in West Africa, that the US and China were working together with local partners as well. But at the moment, I think both heightened sort of geopolitical tensions coming from Washington, coming from Beijing, have upset the potential for this moving forward. It will take, again, I keep on coming to this point, but it will take this sort of political will within the middle powers, within the regional powers, to drive this forward, to get back to your first question, to play the role of bridging powers. And because, a country like South Africa or Nigeria, they will have a legitimacy that outside foreign powers don't have in the region. And that's why I think it's essential for middle powers and regional powers and even small states to realize that they're not simply pawns. They don't just have to react. They can proactively act diplomatically, push trade deals. ASEAN was a powerful force behind the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the big trade deal that China, Japan, Korea are in at the moment. It wasn't these big powers. It was ASEAN really playing the driving force because the big powers couldn't get along on a free trade deal. So they will have to play that role. And more countries will need to look towards Japan as sort of a model for that they can actually influence these sort of global trade deals and partnerships.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question that is, I guess, fairly fundamental, and it's come from in various ways from various questioners, some quite blunt and some more implicit, which is the issue of China's global ambitions. You sort of put it up front and center as almost the assumption from where you begin that it does have global ambitions. But you went to these different continents and regions and engaged with various powers. Is that really the message that you took away, that there is across the world a real solid perception that China has global ambitions and is fairly inexorable, relentless in pursuing them? Or is this, issue of Chinese global ambitions in part really a construction of other powers? I mean, quite naturally, one might say, as China rises, countries like the United States or India or even the EU or Japan would be uneasy. And so what's your sense of it? How much is China perceived in these regions as really being globally ambitious and driving forward almost towards hegemony? And how much is your sense that it's there's a bit of kind of, well, let's put it bluntly, a sort of propaganda out there as well?
There's both. Ultimately, particularly coming out of the US, you will hear, high-level politicians go overboard and exaggerate the nature of China's political system as a totalitarian regime, for example. But in the book and in my own thinking is that, of course, China has global ambitions, and it might not have a system in place and a plan to dominate domestic politics in Africa, in countries, in Latin American countries, but just through its expansion, it has this tendency to influence others and receive pushback. In Argentina, in Kenya, governments have changed their laws, have rewritten legislation to take on Chinese finance. And by changing those laws, they cut off transparency from these deals because China demanded it. So there wasn't civil society oversight. There wasn't as much media oversight. And this influences the systems of others, whether it's deliberate or not. And this also produces local pushback. And that came in Argentina from the private sector, from environmentalists who wanted to see these deals, who wanted to ensure that they didn't damage local ecology. So it's not as simple as whether China has a plan openly stated or not. China's influence and its way of operating affects others. It can affect the politics of other countries because it can affect law, particularly in the developing world. So I think it's important for people to understand that, that of course the US might be generating enormous amounts of propaganda, but China has these individual relationships with other countries, and it does have an influence, much more than it did 10, 20 years ago. And these relationships, are very real, external of what the US and other major powers are saying. China, the US did not create these problems in the South China Sea. These are long-standing historical disputes between China and Southeast Asian countries. The US did not create tensions between China and Europe. European leaders would love to have a very compromising, conciliatory, open relationship with China, particularly in trade and investment. Those tensions were produced out of China's and Europe's relationship, not because the US pulled the string or sent propaganda into Berlin and Brussels. And I think it's important to recognize that, that even if China doesn't have this grand plan, it does have an influence, it does operate in a certain way, and that rubs countries in the wrong way in many cases.
Yeah. Well, Luke, we've pretty much run out of time. I've just got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to try and wrap it up. Is there a final thought that you may have, not prompted by the questions, or but that you might want to share as the interaction has gone, and then I'll just close the session with a couple of thoughts.
No, I mean, the main point that I came out with this book was that we are already in a world where there's a diversity of power, and we need to understand this nuance better. And this China-US framing takes us in the wrong direction, despite its importance.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think you've made that point quite strongly, and a lot of people are asking the question about the future of world order as China rises, as America reacts, as a series of other powers also begin to have an impact. I think you've suggested, in a sense, that world order will be decided not just by China and the United States, but by perhaps a range of middle powers working in their regions. The middle powers have the ability to connect upwards to the very big powers, and they also have the ability, because they're embedded in regions so intimately, to connect to a range of smaller powers as well. And so they're rather important in how I think the future of world order goes. They're also quite adept players in multilateral forums, regional forums. So they're not just norm takers, but they're norm and institution shapers as well, to a considerable extent. And so I think that's one of the very big takeaways that we may have from all of this. I think listeners will appreciate that everything that's gone on is with Chinese investments and outreach and its policies and so on. There are unintended effects, there are some intended, but it's a complex picture. China has, as you point out in the book very nicely, also contributed to positive developments in many regions and countries. On the other hand, it's not all triumphalism. There are problems as well with Chinese policies abroad. Therefore, there's space for China, the United States, other actors, but also middle powers to really think about their reactions to China, and of course, what they can all do together. Thank you very much. I think we've all learned a lot. Much of the debate seems to be about the US-China, as you point out, or it's confined to US-China and its impact on Asia and the reactions of Asians. And I think you very nicely allowed us to see reactions in a larger swath of the world, which are very important and which we in Asia not always abreast of. So thank you very much for doing that, and for taking on a whole a range of questions, really, and answering them very candidly and rigorously. Thanks very much. With that, we've come to 6:30 Singapore time, and that's the end of the session. Let me just thank you on behalf of all the participants and on behalf of the Center on Asia and Globalization in the LQI School. And we hope to see you at an event again with us in the near future. All best, Luke.
Thanks so much for having me. Take care.
Thank you.